The gym smelled like stale sneakers and polished wood when the principal stopped me in line and told my parents I wouldn't be getting a diploma. He stood too close, his clipboard like armor, and said, "You missed 94 days for chemo, policy's policy." The words hit like a punch to the ribs, and I felt the air leave me while the band kept playing a song I couldn't hear. My mother gripped my arm and squeezed like she could press the decision out of him. I wanted to yell that I'd done algebra between infusions, that I'd written essays while hooked to an IV, that I had a perfect 4. But the gym was full of bodies and noise and the kind of official language that eats people up. My parents looked like someone had punched them too. My father's jaw went tight and my mother's eyes went bright with the kind of anger that makes your hands shake. "You can't do this," my mother said, voice low enough to be private but loud enough for the principal to answer. "She's been in treatment. We have notes from Dr. Miller." He flicked through a stack of forms like he was looking for the right excuse to keep his decision comfortable. "Attendance is attendance," he said, like he was reciting a speech he'd practiced. "We follow the rules for everyone." That made me hot inside, raw and small under a weight that had nothing to do with my body. I remember sitting where 100 chairs folded back into themselves, feeling hollowed out like the holes chemo had dug in my calendar. Teachers I'd known for years looked at me the way people look at a museum piece: interesting, tragic, untouchable. They whispered and the whispers slid over the crowd until they reached me. "Too many absences, policy. It's the law." I kept replaying the months I had stolen time from treatment to sit in classrooms. I'd done tests in the oncology ward, answered quizzes in waiting rooms, turned in labs from my hospital bed. None of that mattered to a clock on a wall. My mother and father tried appeal forms that day like people throw spare change into a fountain, hoping for luck. The principal signed something and slid it back with a kind of finality that felt rehearsed. "You can finish your credits next semester," he said. "You can walk once you have the hours." I thought about the months ahead, the hallways I knew by heart becoming a place where I belonged less by every step. I thought about being the only senior who would be retaking classes, while classmates shipped off to colleges and apartments. The idea of sitting in classrooms with kids a year younger tightened my chest in a different kind of pain than chemo did. Summer began with the buzz of other people's plans while mine closed like a book. I watched friends move into dorm rooms and post photos with boxes and new beds, and I scrolled through my phone like I could find the version of myself that had been granted a future. Instead, I saw an empty chair in college orientation pictures, a smiling roommate I'd never meet. The world kept celebrating milestones while mine was put on hold and cataloged as a scheduling problem. My oncologist wrote a letter to the school district arguing that treatment days should not count as truancy. He explained medical necessity and federal protections, and he signed it with his title and clinic letterhead, the kind of paper people listen to. The school board voted without looking like they were choosing my life. The superintendent talked about precedent and slippery slopes as if my body was an experiment, not a person. "If we make an exception, we open the door," he said at the hearing, like policy had more weight than breath. Parents in the bleachers tapped their programs, and one of my teachers, Ms. Carter, my AP English teacher, stood and said, "This is not precedent, this is a person." Her voice cracked, and for a moment I thought the room would tilt. But the board voted to uphold the principal's decision anyway, unanimous and efficient, as if unanimity could justify pain. I spent the summer doing makeup credits and filling out forms that never felt like they were for me so much as paperwork for a system to feel clean again. I read stacks of textbooks in an infusion chair, rewrote lab reports under fluorescent lights, and answered questions from administrators who treated me like the exception they had to document. Friends called with news of dorms, bike rides, and textbooks. I put on a face and congratulated them because I couldn't be bitter and be sick at the same time. Sometimes I cried into a pillow at night and imagined a different line in that gym where the principal's clipboard had dropped and someone else had had the courage to say yes. By the end of the summer, I had small victories that felt like bribes. A phone call from a college that said they'd hold my spot if I could finish credits, a counselor who agreed to proctor exams at odd hours. But the core hurt stayed steady: no diploma at graduation, no walk on that stage, no certificate tacked to a wall for years. I kept thinking how many times survival had been reduced to paperwork and how little that matched the nights I had been sure I would not wake. The world around my illness moved on with lists and rules instead of asking the simple question: how do we help a kid get an education while she is trying to live? Fall semester started with a raw edge, like an old wound that never quite stopped leaking. My oncologist's letter to the school board had been ignored, and the superintendent defended the principal's call as necessary precedent. They talked about policies like they were laws of nature, not choices people made. Teachers walked around me and lowered their voices like pity was contagious. I felt it every time someone said, "We're so sorry," as if I were a sickness they had to explain away instead of a kid who wanted to finish school. The classroom felt smaller because every glance measured me. I showed up early, took the seat against the window, and kept my head down through lectures. I did the work quietly, notes scribbled on thin paper between sips of water and tremors from steroids, but it never seemed to erase the blank where a diploma should have been. Counselors sent emails full of bureaucratic kindness, offering remote coursework and makeup hours. I said yes to everything because I needed options, but each accommodation felt like a bandage on a broken bone. Practical, but not fixing the thing that hurt. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Then one Wednesday in creative writing, a new person sat beside me. She introduced herself with a soft laugh and a carried book bag that had more pins than sense. Hannah, a transfer student from across the country, smiled and asked what I was scribbling. I told her the short truth that I wrote to stay sane, and she asked, "Can I read that?" in a voice that sounded like curiosity, not judgment. I gave her a crumpled stack of pages I'd been carrying around as proof of living. She read in the lunchroom while kids tapped on phones and traded fries. I watched her at first, worried she'd close the paper and hand it back. Instead, she leaned in, not like someone prying but like someone listening. When she finished a story about diagnosis day, she didn't gasp. She folded my pages gently and said, "This should be a book." Her words landed in me the way a warm blanket does after a cold day, unexpected and honest. I laughed because it felt too big, and she just said, "Let's try." Hannah started eating lunch with me, not as a show but as a habit. We set up afternoons in the library where she typed and I talked, turning fragments into scenes. She did the things I couldn't do well when chemo made my hands numb. She drilled through my fog and pulled out the moments that mattered. I talked about waking in a hospital at 3 a.m., about the way needles felt like a tax on breathing, about radiation burns and missing prom. She listened and asked the small questions that made details stand up straight, like, what did the IV pump sound like? Or who stayed in the room with you that night? Those questions fixed things on paper. She pushed me too. When I said something half-hearted like, "Who would read this?" she shot back, "People who need it, parents who don't know what to do, teachers who think rules trump life." Her confidence rubbed off. She started organizing my messy files, renaming folders, and creating a timeline so the book stopped sounding like a medical chart and started sounding like a life. Sometimes she got impatient, cut comments sharply, reordered chapters, until I trusted her edits because they made the story cleaner and truer. Hannah had her own quiet ways of helping. She tracked down contacts for me, bloggers who cared about medical advocacy, an editor from a small press she knew through a cousin, a friend who ran a podcast about young adults and illness. She didn't force anything. She tested ideas like a scientist and then let me choose. Once she sent a piece to an online magazine without asking, and when it received comments and shares, I realized she was pushing doors open I hadn't dared to knock on. That first online story drew messages from other kids who'd lost days to treatment and were being punished for it. Their words made my anger less personal and more a map of a system that needed fixing. School days started feeling less like walking on broken glass and more like something I could shape. I still had bad hours, tests where my brain fogged, moments when the cafeteria lights made my head spin, but Hannah sat with me through them or typed my answers when my hands refused. Teachers stopped muttering. Some started to pay attention in new ways, asking questions about how to support students with chronic conditions. Not everyone changed, but cracks appeared in the armor of indifference, and the cracks were something we could work with. By the end of the semester, the pages had swollen into a manuscript that felt like a living thing instead of a wound. We had chapters about the school calling treatment truancy, about nights waiting for test results, and about the small kindnesses that kept me moving. Hannah said we'd find a way to make it public, to turn personal pain into something that could be used. I wasn't sure yet if I wanted that kind of exposure, but I also didn't want to be the only kid who took that pain and swallowed it. She said, "This could change things," and for the first time in months I believed her. Hannah ate with me every day and learned my rhythms, how chemo made mornings slow and nights loud with worry so she could catch details I missed. She sat across from me at the library table, propping her laptop while I talked through the days, infusion lines that hummed, the taste of metal after a dose, the way teachers treated me like a cautionary tale. She typed everything without drama. She didn't make a show of saving me. She listened, then nudged me toward doing something with the mess. "You're telling a story people need to hear," she said once, eyes steady. "We have to make it count." She organized chapters like she was assembling a map. We broke the timeline into parts: diagnosis, hospital nights, the school's letter, graduation day when the principal denied me a diploma. She asked the practical questions nobody else did: who was with you the night you puked in the bathroom? And she kept asking until I remembered details that mattered. When my hands wouldn't hold a pen, she recorded me and turned my voice into paragraphs. When steroid fog made me repeat myself, she sat patient and rewove my sentences into something that moved. I started to feel honest on the page in ways I hadn't felt in months. Without telling me, she emailed the finished manuscript to her father, an editor at a small publishing house, because she thought it needed a proper path. I felt betrayed for a beat, then curious, then oddly relieved. I trusted her judgment even when she jumped ahead. 3 weeks later his call came, and I remember the way my stomach dropped and then lifted at the same time. "We want to publish this," he said, and his voice was careful and fierce, like someone who'd seen a lot of manuscripts and rarely found work that mattered. Hannah grinned in the background like she'd been saving this moment. When the memoir came out in March, reporters swarmed our phones like bees. I was not ready for the noise that followed. "Is this true?" one reporter asked, voice thin with the kind of hunger cameras feed on. I told the truth over and over: how I'd kept a 4 through treatment, how the principal had said, "You missed 94 days, and each telling made it less raw and more fact. A leaked clip of him announcing I couldn't graduate went viral. The video was short, his clipboard, that line said with a casual cruelty. People replayed it, and my name showed up in comments like a small, stubborn echo. Parents started showing up at school board meetings with stacks of my book in hand. They read passages out loud about being denied accommodations and called for change. Other students testified, their voices shaking but loud, about being punished for missing school for surgeries and treatments. They labeled my chemo days as truancy, one kid said, and everyone in the room leaned in. The superintendent tried to argue precedent, but his words felt thin in the face of printed pages that named specific harms. Board members shuffled papers, some parents cried. I sat in the back and let their words carry me forward. Local stations wanted interviews. National outlets picked up the story. Messages poured into my inbox, people telling their own stories, parents thanking me for finally naming a problem, lawyers offering help. "We can file complaints," one attorney wrote. A podcaster invited me to talk about policy reforms. Hannah managed the schedule from my bed, keeping chaos from swallowing us. She sent my father's email threads to reporters, answered questions about dates, and corrected details so my story stayed true. She did everything a friend would do and more, like a partner you find when nothing else makes sense. The movement grew faster than I could breathe. Grassroots groups formed online, using chapters from the book as templates for petitions. A nonprofit printed pamphlets with legal steps for families fighting attendance denials. Parents who had been quietly furious now had language and a path forward. "We didn't know what to do," a woman told me at a town hall. "You gave us a blueprint." Seeing families stand up gave me a new kind of strength. It felt strange to be both vulnerable and powerful at once. Still, not everyone loved what we were doing. The principal's supporters said we'd humiliated him. The superintendent warned about precedent. I heard the scoffs and the thin arguments on panels where people spoke in hypotheticals instead of naming real kids. But for every skeptical voice, there were 10 that had been ignored until we made noise. The momentum was messy, loud, and sometimes cruel, but it was moving. I couldn't control where it would go, only that it had started because I'd told something true and Hannah had pushed me to let it loose. The book's pages had become more than words. They were a lever, and suddenly people were pulling. The second graduation felt like walking through someone else's movie. I had a diploma in my hand, my name called, and a book tour starting the next day that felt like proof someone had listened. The gym was louder this time. People who hadn't believed us the first time clapped like they were making up for lost time. But the noise was thin against the ache I'd been carrying for weeks. Hannah stood at the podium as valedictorian and made the place hush. She talked about policy and cruelty and said my name like it mattered. She read a passage from the book and said, "Rules are meant to protect people, not punish them." And people leaned forward as if leaning could fix what had been broken. After the speeches, everyone wanted pictures, and for a beat I let it feel like normal life: smiles, hugs, hands on my shoulders. My mother cried and laughed at once. She pressed the diploma against her chest like a shield. Reporters hovered politely, and a handful of classmates I hadn't seen in months came up and said things that sounded new. Hannah hugged me tight and whispered, "You did it, we did it." It felt honest and weird, and I told myself to hold the moment because I didn't know when another one would come. Then the old pain I'd been pretending wasn't there decided to show up. It began as a soft warning behind my eyes, then sharpened into a strike that made my knees go weak. My vision blurred like someone had smeared Vaseline across my world, and blood trickled from my nose into my hands. I remember a flash of white tile and then the gym seemed to tilt. I dropped the diploma because my fingers wouldn't hold it, and the applause folded into a wet sound that came from far away. Panic unspooled in the faces around me. The principal was walking past, his body angled like he had places to be, and he stopped long enough to say, loud and clear for half the crowd, "Guess you won't make that tour now." His voice landed on me like another blow. People turned toward him as if he'd made a joke. My mother screamed and a teacher shouted for help. Hannah didn't listen to him. She grabbed my hand and held it so hard I felt my bones remember her strength. I tasted copper and the floor seemed both very close and impossibly far away. EMTs pushed through in a blur. Uniforms, straps, bright lights. Hannah rode with me in the ambulance even though she could have followed in a car. She climbed in like someone who belonged there and sat by my head while machines beeped and the siren cut the air. She talked to the crew like she'd been doing it for years. She had chemo last spring, high-dose steroids last month, MRIs showed 3 lesions in the brain, she said, and her voice was calm in the way of people who are used to holding facts in their hands. She named every drug, every dose, every scan date from memory because she had helped compile my records for the book, and had spent hours learning medicine like a new language. An EMT checked my pupils and muttered things into a radio. They taped gauze to my nose and lifted me into the stretcher. Through the ambulance window, the crowd was small and odd, like ants gathering around a fallen thing. Hannah kept talking to the paramedics, answering questions I couldn't answer. She told them when I'd been admitted last, what my baseline looked like, and who to call. She pressed my hand and said, "It's going to be okay," and I felt that sentence land with a familiar mix of hope and fear. At the ER, they wheeled me under fluorescent lights that smelled like antiseptic and tired hope. Doctors and nurses moved like a practiced dance, and I saw my mother's face pale and close in the chaos. Hannah stayed while they did scans, pacing the hallway the way you pace when you're holding other people's timelines in your head. She called Dr. Jonas Miller and read him a list of meds like she was reading scripture. I tried to tell her I was sorry for collapsing, for making the end of graduation ugly, but the words came out thin. "You don't get to be sorry for being sick," she said, and then she kissed my forehead as if that could seal everything safe for a moment. The hours that followed were a blur of CTs and orders and long waits that felt too full of threat. Steroids landed in my IV like a chemical rain, meant to quiet the swelling and the pain. Nurses kept asking questions and writing in neat lines that tried to make the chaos legible. People came and went, my parents, a hospital chaplain, a journalist who had been trying to reach me since the book had come out. Every time Hannah checked my charts, she found a new hole I hadn't seen, a date I'd forgotten, and she reminded us all what we had already survived. That night, as the hospital hums kept time, I learned how much one person can hold for another, and how fast public victory can be followed by private fights for breath. The scans came back and the room felt like it closed in on me. CT and MRI showed 3 lesions, small dark shapes on black and white pages, and when Dr. Jonas Miller, my oncologist, sat down, he did not soften the words. He said, "The cancers crossed into the central nervous system." His voice was steady, the kind that tries to be practical but can't hide how bad things are. He explained that CNS involvement is serious but not always hopeless, that aggressive protocols could help, and that we'd start with high-dose steroids to reduce swelling right away. I watched my parents' faces move through shock and anger like a slow film. Dr. Miller drew out a plan on a scrap of paper, a rough map of chemo, radiation, and follow-up scans, and he spoke in steps so we didn't memorize terror all at once. "Steroids will buy us time," he said. "They'll bring down the swelling so we can see the lesions better and consider targeted treatments." He didn't promise miracles, he promised work. I felt the weight of each phrase, the inventory of measures you take when survival is a list of actions. Hannah sat at the edge of the bed, phone open, typing answers into a note because my parents asked frantic questions faster than anyone could write. My mother clutched my hand until her knuckles went white. "Why didn't we know sooner?" she asked, voice breaking like a twig. My father shook his head like he could shake sense into the world. "What's the timeline?" he demanded, and the room filled with a litany of dates and possibilities that meant nothing and everything at once. Hannah read back the details, corrected a date, reminded us what test had been done and when. She moved as if she had rehearsed crisis, which, in a way, she had. She'd helped pull medical records into sentences for the book and learned the names of drugs like vocab. Then Melissa came in. Melissa, a foundation director Jonas recommended, who ran a nonprofit supporting young cancer patients. She introduced herself quietly, and when she spoke it felt like someone had brought a toolkit into the room. "I'll coordinate your care," she said, and she meant everything that phrase suggested. She talked about support at home, logistical help with appointments, and advocacy to handle the public side so I could focus on treatment. She promised to deal with the legal and school drama, to call lawyers she trusted, to manage calls so my parents weren't the bridge for every activist email. The relief that passed through me was almost obscene. Suddenly there was a person whose job was to untie the knots nobody else could. Melissa set up a plan in hours that probably would have taken weeks if we tried alone. She made calls, drafted emails, and connected us with people who could fast-track scans and coordinate specialists. She said, "You shouldn't have to pick between making a speech and staying alive." And that sentence made the fight outside the hospital feel, for a moment, like something other people could carry. Hannah handed Melissa files and timelines she had prepared for the book. Together, they became a team that could both push policy and track steroids without anyone getting lost. Outside the hospital, the world reacted like flint to a spark. Petitions that had been simmering exploded into signatures, and parents who had been filing quiet complaints suddenly filled the town square. Emergency board meetings were scheduled as crowds gathered with copies of chapters from the book in their hands, and an attorney who worked with disability rights groups filed formal complaints about the district's handling of medical absences. The state education office opened an investigation, sending letters that felt formal and sharp, and reporters called with questions we had no energy to answer. The principal was placed on leave pending the investigation, a small public consequence that felt both vindictive and insufficient. The community response moved faster than I could process. Neighbors I barely knew showed up at the hospital with casseroles and cards. Parents marched into meetings carrying printed pages from the memoir and demanded accountability. Other students testified about being punished for surgeries, for prolonged absences, for being too sick to sit in a seat for a required number of hours. Their voices, which had been private and frightened, became public and loud. Each new testimony read like another tile, laid into a bigger pattern that people could finally see. Back in the hospital, my life narrowed to appointments, medicines, and waiting. Doctors talked about aggressive protocols, combining drugs, targeted radiation, clinical trials, and I listened because what else was there to do? Melissa organized the legal calls so my parents didn't have to answer every reporter or board member. Hannah kept notes, kept proof, and kept me aware of the movement that had grown from pages I had written to actions that might change law. The scans had shown 3 lesions and a terrible fact about spread, but they also showed the beginning of support that might save a future for other kids who would otherwise be punished for living. Treatment hit like a backhand I didn't see coming. Fevers that climbed too fast, nights where I couldn't stop vomiting, and a numbness that crawled through my fingers until I couldn't hold a pen. Steroids made my face puffy and my thoughts bright and scattered. The chemo drugs left me weak and constipated and furious in a way that didn't look like anger. I learned quickly how fragile routine was. One missed dose, one bad night, and everything tipped. The nurses called it expected, I called it brutal. I told myself to keep writing, to keep the story honest. Because when you're shrinking every day into hospital time, the only control you get is what you put into words. Hannah adapted like a machine built out of stubbornness and care. She took to standing over me while I dictated chapters, catching the fragments that spilled out when my hands failed. She learned my pauses and my swear words and typed like someone assembling a life from scattered paper. When the book tour moved virtual, she set up the camera, loaded the links, and ran interviews from my hospital room while I lay wired to IVs and monitors. "You say the part about the principal again," she'd prompt, and I would, and then her fingers would keep moving so the words lived on a page where they mattered more than they did in my head. She never made me feel like I owed her anything. She just did it because she chose to. Marco, Dr. Jonas Miller's son, came by one afternoon. He wasn't a doctor, he was Jonas's kid who also happened to keep showing up with practical things, books with notes, sneakers for short walks, and a bluntness that felt like medicine. He sat on the edge of my bed and said, "Listen, recovery isn't neat. You'll have good weeks and wrecked weeks. People will tell you to hope politely, but hope is messy." He had a way of giving prognosis without false cheer. He told me about rehab, the slow climb back to small tasks, the way neuropathy can linger and how some losses never fully return. But he also talked about things that improved. The first time he could tie his own shoe after chemo, the first time he ate without retching, and those small facts sounded like proof that the road existed. Melissa kept a different kind of schedule. As the foundation director Jonas recommended, she moved like a coordinator who had learned to cut through red tape. She filed complaints with the school district, compiled medical records into neat packets, and connected our lawyers with disability advocates. She called reporters, drafted public statements, and handled the paperwork that used to make me dizzy at the thought. "You don't have to be the voice for everything," she said. "You tell your story, we'll fight the rest." Her promise took pressure off my parents and let them be scared without having to become activists overnight. Within weeks, the media attention spiraled. Local and national outlets picked up the story, op-eds ran, parents called with their own horror stories. Legal filings followed the pages of the book, formal complaints to the state education office and lawsuits that argued the district had violated students' rights. The superintendent, who had defended the policy as precedent, resigned under the pressure of public outrage and the formal probes. Watching his name leave the building felt like a small, cold relief, like a bandage ripped off. The district installed a new leader, someone whose daughter had a chronic condition and who wasted no time launching policy reviews. It was almost absurd how fast things moved once people's private stories turned public. A state senator used our story as the backbone for a bill guaranteeing medical exemptions for student absences, and suddenly our fight had a frame bigger than the town. If you're undergoing treatment, your education can't be a reason to risk health, he said in a hearing, and his words translated our messy, painful months into legal language. Melissa worked with his office, providing documentation and connecting families who would testify. We watched hearings online and felt the strange combination of hope and exposure, relief that the law might shift, terror at how public we had become. Treatment still chewed up days. Neuropathy made typing slow and sloppy, and sometimes my legs refused to hold me up for more than a minute. But there were small wins, a round of scans that showed the lesions shrinking, an afternoon where I actually finished a chapter without needing a nap, and a walk in the hospital courtyard where the air didn't taste like antiseptic. Hannah celebrated these like holidays. She made playlists for chemo days and sat through every appointment, logging blood counts and side effects with the patience of someone building a map. The work we started moved beyond me. Melissa's foundation issued toolkits, advocates used our story in school board trainings, lawyers filed cases that cited our complaints. The superintendent's resignation and the new leader's reforms were not the end, but they were a start. Marco's blunt honesty and Hannah's steady fingers kept me tethered when my body was unreliable. I learned that survival wasn't only medical. Sometimes it needed organizers, lawyers, and friends who could type my name into the record and not let the story die. The fight was getting bigger, and for the first time in a long while, that size felt like a kind of protection. The scans started to give us good news in small doses, first stability, then slow, stubborn shrinkage. I remember sitting in a chair with a blanket over my knees and watching images that used to look like threats begin to look like progress. The relief was weird and fragile, like thin glass you were afraid to touch too hard. Doctors would smile in careful ways and say, "This is positive," and I'd nod because I wanted to believe them because hope needed anchors. But progress didn't mean ease. It meant nights in the ICU when fevers spiked and monitors flooded the room with sound. And it meant waking up to new pain and new rules for my body that felt unending. ICU nights were a different kind of living. Machines kept time for me while my family sat in stiff chairs that never felt made for sleeping. Nurses moved around me with a flow I envied. Everything had a reason and a rhythm. I learned to count the beeps and read the meaning of their faces. Some nights I couldn't sleep because the steroids made my thoughts run like a river. Other nights I'd sleep hard and wake with a mouth full of cotton and a memory like a broken film. Those nights taught me patience and how to ask for what I needed even when the ask felt small. They also taught me how much energy it takes to survive, beyond the obvious medical facts. Side effects came hard and fast, vomiting so forceful it left me weak for days, neuropathy that made my hands feel like they belonged to someone else, and the slow, steady loss of hair. Hair falling out was a strange public grief because it showed the world I was sick in a way people could see. The first handful clumped in my brush and I sat on the bathroom floor and let it happen because there was nothing else to do. I felt exposed and oddly naked even in my own skin. I thought about wigs and hats and the small ways people tried to make illness less visible. But the big truth was that my body was changing whether I liked it or not. Hannah came back from a barbershop with a clean-shaven head and a grin that made me laugh and cry at once. She was valedictorian, my friend, and a human who had decided solidarity was worth scalp-level demonstration. "We both owe each other honesty," she said, and then she wrapped a towel around my shoulders like it was a signal the world could read. Her head looked like mine without hair, and suddenly the room felt less clinical and more chosen. People who had been awkward around my illness could not avoid the image of two students with matching heads. It leveled some of the pity and replaced it with something fiercer. We used the momentum of the book and the press to create a nonprofit. It felt odd to go from patient to organizer, but we needed structure to match the anger and the lawyering. The nonprofit used proceeds to fund legal fights for families who'd been denied accommodations. We produced toolkits, simple step-by-step guides that told parents how to document absences, when to request records, and how to file complaints. We held webinars where lawyers explained rights and where parents shared what had worked. The idea was to make the pathway we had stumbled into a road others could follow with confidence. When you're sick, paperwork shouldn't be the barrier to getting an education. It should be the tool parents use to protect it. Legal pressure built and the principal could not hide behind policy forever. Investigations found enough that he faced consequences, civil penalties, hearings, and eventually the revocation of his teaching license. I sat in a courtroom once with my mother's hand in mine and watched the man who'd said policy's policy in a gym become a different kind of figure, someone who had to answer to laws and federal standards. It was not revenge, it was accountability. The point had never been to punish one person, so much as to make sure no one else paid the price for bureaucracy. Federal findings followed. The Office for Civil Rights issued a report that said the district had violated disability laws in multiple ways and ordered systemic reforms. Reading that 47-page document felt surreal because it turned our stories and our evidence into a legal fact. The ruling required the district to revise attendance policies, train staff, and submit to audits. Those requirements became a template other districts could not ignore. Families across states started to use the findings as precedent, sending the report to their own school boards and threatening lawsuits if changes weren't made. The movement we had started was no longer only in our town. It had a reach and a set of tools. The wins didn't make the scars vanish. ICU nights and scalp scars and memories of being told no at graduation stayed with me, but the change mattered. Our nonprofit kept funding cases and the toolkits helped parents talk to schools without feeling like they were banging against a locked door. Hannah and I kept writing about recovery, about policy, about the many small indignities sick kids face. We built a system that tried to make sure education protected life instead of punishing it. And in doing so, we turned a stolen diploma into something bigger than any one of us. The truth we put in print had pushed policy and law, and the precedent it created became a lifeline for others who followed. Months after that stolen graduation, my scans finally cleared and I was declared in remission, and the relief felt like someone pulling a heavy coat off my shoulders on a hot day. I remember Dr. Jonas Miller saying the word remission like it was both careful and bright, and the nurses cheering like it was a minor holiday. I cried in a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and hope, and my parents laughed and sobbed at once because they had been living in a thin, taut place for so long. I didn't feel normal. Remission didn't erase the months of ICU nights or the nights I woke convinced my body had betrayed me. But it gave me a shape to work toward and a reason to keep pushing the work we'd started. We kept building almost by muscle memory, writing, talking, and turning chaos into systems. Hannah, who had been valedictorian and my closest ally, and I wrote a sequel to the memoir that dug into recovery, the hard bureaucratic fights, and the ways people survived when systems failed them. We wrote about the small wins no one notices, the nurse who stayed late to handhold, the teacher who learned to ask the right question, and the friends who showed up without drama. The sequel was not just therapy, it was a tool. We used it to fund the foundation and to give voice to families who had lost time to treatment and found their schools closed a door in their faces. The foundation we started used book proceeds to support 100 families in the first year, helping pay for lawyers, transportation to medical appointments, and the small things insurance didn't cover. Melissa, the foundation director, set up grants and legal aid and made sure families had access to the toolkits we had written. Those toolkits explained simple steps. Document everything, get medical letters, request meetings, file formal complaints when needed. They also included stories of people who had done the hard thing already, so families wouldn't feel alone when they walked into a school board meeting. The foundation turned our anger into infrastructure that other people could use. Policy followed the pressure. A state senator used our case to draft a bill guaranteeing medical exemptions for student absences, and the hearings felt surreal because I had to speak like a fact and not like a kid who'd been hurt. I testified in a room full of lawmakers and parents and lots of microphones, and I told them plainly what had happened. My treatment days were labeled truancy. I missed a walk on stage because someone decided hours mattered more than life. The senator's bill passed and created a legal safety net, automatic exemptions when doctors certified medical treatment, which meant less paperwork for desperate parents and fewer kids shoved into repeat classes because they had been sick. Campuses prepared for me too. When the university sent paperwork for enrollment, it included an accommodations plan ready to activate, priority scheduling, recorded lectures, and flexible attendance policies. It felt strange and good to open a packet that treated my medical needs as normal logistics instead of exceptions. Hannah and I moved into a small apartment within walking distance of our campuses, splitting rent, groceries, and a toaster that always seemed to burn our bread. We made a home where scans and appointments were part of life but not the whole of it. We cooked bad pasta, read badly edited essays aloud, and argued about chapter titles until one of us gave in. Our days blurred between school and advocacy. I took classes, wrote essays, and taught a workshop on narrative medicine. Hannah taught a freshman seminar on storytelling and ethics. We testified at other hearings, sat on panels, and kept the foundation running because momentum only survives steady hands. Sometimes I spoke and felt raw, other times the words came like a well-practiced script. The movement we had sparked needed witnesses who could share both the pain and the method for change. And I found that my story had grown useful in a way I never wanted but had to accept. The legal precedents had ripple effects. The federal findings in our state law gave families across the country routes to demand change, and we heard from parents in other states saying they used our toolkit to win meetings and force policy revisions. Lawyers cited the Office for Civil Rights report in complaints and won settlements that included training requirements for district staff. The principal who'd stood in that gym lost his license and faced penalties, and that consequence, small as it felt against months of hurt, served as a warning other administrators could not ignore. It didn't unring the bell of that first graduation, but it made sure other kids would not be the next bell's victim. Remission taught me that surviving can be both quiet and loud. I kept follow-up scans and long appointments, but I also learned to host dinners and send essays to journals, and to fall asleep without checking a phone for test results. The movement we built from that cruel decision to deny a diploma had turned into a national campaign that protected students whose lives require medical care. That truth made me proud and tired and wholly human. Surviving had become a way to change law, policy, and the small acts of cruelty that hide behind the word policy. And for that, the stolen diploma felt like the beginning of something larger than any of us had expected. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.